Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgoway. And now the host of your show, Janelle Elgoway and Dr. Kline.
Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on Ka360 Network with co-host Dr. Kline and I'm Janelle Elgoway. Joining us tonight is special guest Dr. Linda Cheek. There are two ways to listen into tonight's program: through our website, www.collination.com, or YouTube channel, The Doctor's Corner. Make sure to please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get reminders of when we are on live. Dr. Kline loves to hear from you and answer all your questions from our mailbag. If you have future mailbag questions, please email them to Janelle, Jonelle, .elgaway at caw360.com. If anyone would like to call in with a question this evening, you can do so at 415-403-2715. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Kline and Dr. Linda Cheek to the Doctor's Corner. How is everyone doing this evening?
Doing wonderful, thank you.
Yes, I'm just dandy.
Good. Before we start, is there anything newsworthy that has occurred recently that you'd like to share with us? Dr. Kline, would you like to start?
I've heard I did read briefly, and if anybody has any further information, the terror of the witch hunt, and this is not a metaphor, this is a real thing. The government is going after people out of fear. That's what caused the Salem witch trials. People were so afraid that they hung their neighbors and watched them die. And what's going on in this country that's been going on for 100 years is people are so frightened of these pain medicines as a representation almost of the devil that people are going nuts. This has been 3 years now since the CDC regulations ignited the spark and then threw accelerant on it for the prejudice that goes back 100 years. So we are seeing things that I would have never dreamed possible. For example, a state is considering outlawing the use of fentanyl because all they hear about is fentanyl is killing people. Fentanyl is killing people. They're killing people on the streets, street addicts, or as my friend, the street addict, said, junkies. They call each other junkies. And that makes it real clear who we're talking about. But this all went back to 1909. That's when the epidemic of illegal drugs began, 1909. There was a law passed for opium, because that was the only product at the time in addition to morphine. Opium restriction to keep it out of the United States because they were afraid the Chinese were inducing white women to run off with them. This enraged Randolph Hearst, who a few years before put in his newspaper a lot of untrue stories about how white women were losing their virtues. And you see a lot of words like vice and virtue back at the turn of the century. So the government became so afraid they began to do what they should not do, which is interfere with the practice of medicine. 95% of opiate products manufactured today go for the relief of pain, 95%. So the majority of opium products back then were going for pain relief. You could buy it across the counter. You could buy heroin across the counter. It was manufactured by then. But what happened in 1909 with the government now restricting the opium products, not for doctors, but for everyone else, that the street prices started to soar. Pharmacies started to charge enormous amounts, and that's when the criminal empire for drugs started, 1909. It was then kicked into high gear in 1915 by the Harrison Act, and that's when doctors began to be arrested, 1915, for treating addicts. The Harrison Act had a clause in it, just like our laws have now. As long as you were practicing a legitimate doctor's office, legitimate practice, you could prescribe all the narcotics you wanted. But the federal police at the time, the narcotics squads from the Treasury Department, that doctors giving opiates to addicts was not within the legitimate practice of medicine. And of course, treating an addict is well within the practice of medicine. So this is when it started, and it's continued since then. It's got nothing to do with 1999. It's got nothing to do with Purdue. It's got nothing to do with the long list of people responsible for the epidemic. So a long way around, now states hear that people are dying of fentanyl. Nobody ever asked the critical question, who is dying of fentanyl overdose? Dying
So who is?
the street addicts. People on the street are dying from anything they can get their hands on because they have a disease. And nobody wants to talk about it, and nobody wants to believe it. But what we call type 2 opiate addicted people have a disease. And we know it because if you look at street heroin addicts, they all behave in the same manner. They all have intense seeking of substance. Well, they should just know better. No, that's not it. They have a disease. There's intense seeking of water in people with nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, which is a disease where you lose your ability to control your hormonal ability to control the intake of water. I had a patient, and she would wheel over to a drinking fountain and just sit there with her face over it because people weren't giving her water. In the Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a developmentally delayed syndrome, there is an intense seeking of food to the point that refrigerators have to be locked. These children get to be 300 pounds. So there are other circumstances where there is intense seeking of substance. So this, so I'm sort of drifting off here, aren't I? Just, kind of bring me back. But so when you have people running around with this intense seeking of substance, stealing and shoplifting and manipulating doctors, it becomes very scary. And people have been frightened ever since 1909 of the effects of addiction, but that's because we're confusing the types of addiction. People who go crazy with drugs are not opiate addicts. They are amphetamine addicts, methamphetamine, ecstasy. People on cocaine, taking too much cocaine, can have a toxic psychosis. Alcohol, as we mentioned before, is the worst. So what we should be afraid of is people who have intense seeking for alcohol, intense, or rather not intense, but seeking for amphetamines, because these people are the real criminals. So in other words, if we are afraid of people with addiction, we should be afraid of those folks, not people who are opiate addicts. Studies have shown that people who are opiate addicts are triggered immediately on their first pill. That's not, creating an addiction, that's triggering an addiction. And that their profile of criminality is certainly there, and they will tell you it's there, but it does not involve violent crime. So we're afraid of the wrong people. We should be going after methamphetamine manufacturers, which the DEA does do, but that should be the focus of our fear. People with type 2 opiate addiction have a true disease. It's weird, but it's a true disease. It starts immediately with the first exposure to an opiate, and then it just continues. Can you treat it? Certainly you can treat it. You can bring people into the office and say, hey, here's how we're going to treat it. And there's several ways to do it, which we're not going to get into. But it is a treatable side effect of the drug. There are other drugs like Humira, which is the most popular drug on the planet, where you can develop a lymphoma. It can suppress your immune system to the point that you just quietly die. And so those are a lot worse side effects. So if we had to be frightened of a drug, let's say we're coming from Mars and we want to run around and be frightened of drugs, we should be frightened of Humira and drugs that have very serious side effects. One of my people who tweeted said, you know what, with all the pain I'm in, if I get addicted, so what? That's a lot better than being in pain. And I thought, wow, she's actually right. So this goes back to the legislators trying to practice medicine. Oh, if we just ban the fentanyl, we won't have any more problems. In 1909, if we just ban the opium, we'll be fine. 1915, if we just ban, in 1925, if we just ban heroin, we'll be fine. And it doesn't work. So.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions from our mailbag. And the first question I have that goes along with what you're just talking about. People are wondering what the numbers that the CDC or whoever uses for the amount of people that struggle with addiction within the United States. That number, does it include, is it just people that are addicted to opiates, or is it people with cocaine and everything else?
Very good point. And the CDC, I'm afraid, doesn't do very good science, and one wonders why. This is a group of PhD scientists. These are hardcore scientists down there in Atlanta. These people do calculus and blah, blah, blah. But they're very free with words. You can't say that you can't use addiction numbers because there's two big types. Just like we've mentioned before, in diabetes, there's two types of diabetes. Children's onset and adult onset, they're very different. They have different pathologies under the microscope. They have different complication rates, etc. So whenever doctors talk about diabetes, the first question is, well, which one are you talking about? Type 1 or type 2? Same thing with addiction. If they come up with these figures of addiction, you need to, as good listeners, say, well, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about opiate addiction? Because that's different than people who are addicted to marijuana, addicted to alcohol, addicted to cocaine, addicted to methamphetamine. So we do need a good definition for addiction. My definition is involvement with a substance to the point that it's ruining your daily life. That's what I think is now a disease. Disease means ill at ease, dis-ease. If nothing is going on, then you don't have a disease. Somebody who gets up every morning and smokes marijuana, as soon as they get home, they smoke marijuana. I mean, people don't approve of that. But if they're working and raising their family and making love, so what? They don't have a disease. But there are people that smoke marijuana every single day, can't work, don't go to school. Life is shot to pieces, no boyfriends or girlfriends. That's a disease. So my definition of addiction, involvement with a substance to the point that it's ruining your daily life. But type 2 addiction, junkies, heroin addicts, different story. Very different story. The definition of type 2 addiction is intense seeking without regard for consequence. And that's a definition that a friend of mine who is a heroin addict came up with, he and I together. So that's our definition. So it's a different story for type 2. And it's ironic that type 2 really we should be less afraid of than, as I mentioned, than people who've got problems with alcohol. Alcohol is the number one associated drug with violent crime. And you all know that. You hear stories of people being beat up, by the drunken husband, that sort of thing. So you got to be real careful nobody has really asked questions of the CDC. See, we all trusted them. And that was a mistake. Because what they're doing is they're presenting dubious data and distorted research, and I think bias on purpose. For example, not explaining that the 47,000 people or the 30,000 people or the 17,000 people, who knows what the number is, die each year. Who are they? Well, the people that are dying are heroin addicts or fentanyl addicts or addicts to hardcore IV drugs. But they don't mention that. So you see what they're doing is they are having a campaign of terror. Now remember that people who plan these campaigns of terror, very clever. The idea is to make you so afraid it changes your behavior. That's the whole purpose of terrorism. So the CDC is doing that. And they are making people so frightened that legislators are passing laws interfering with the practice of medicine. We know that type 2 heroin addiction, opiate addiction starts with the very first pill, and we're going to be confirming that soon. We have 20 cases so far, and we're going to try to go for 100 by talking to heroin addicts, but this is the story. It happens immediately. Okay, so that makes it a disease, you know. So the question about addicts and everything and numbers of people dying, got to ask questions like good reporters. 47,000 people died last year in Alaska. From what? You know, I could just make up these things, you know. Oh, good heavens. Did you know 700 people died in Arizona? What did they die from? You know, see, that's an absurd statement, but that's what the CDC is doing. They're saying, oh, 500 people in Arizona die from overdose. Overdose of what? Who were they? You know? So okay. So next question.
Yes. A lot of people are asking, is Dr. Andrew Kalani under investigation?
That's some rumor. I have not heard any confirmation of that. And we checked with Dr. Creek too. No, not Dr. Creek. That's a different doctor.
Okay.
Dr. Cheek.
All right, I only have one more question.
Yes, Dr. Creek is also very famous.
On your face, Dr. Kline.
Yes, well, you know, as you get older.
Too many donuts.
Too many, oh God, you'd have to bring that up.
You know,
you and
talking
my
about
mother-in-law.
the CDC, by the way, they hired a PR firm called PRR when they right before they came out with the CDC guidelines in 2016. Why would they do that?
They were actually, my understanding of that is they were afraid of a negative reaction, and so this outfit did up some polls. Is that what you've heard, Linda, about the PR firm? Do you know anything about that CDC hired?
No, I have no idea.
Okay.
They need one.
Yeah, they do. Apparently, it was only for a brief period of time, and the PR firm apparently told them, you're in trouble. You know, people are not buying this, and so we don't know a lot of the details. We should, though, because we're taxpayers, and they were spending taxpayers' money.
Right. Well, part of what they did, though, is they would put out graphics and stuff like that for primary care doctors saying 1 out of 4 patients that take opioids will become addicted.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. You see, what's going on? A federal agency has hired a PR firm. How often do they do that? You know, and to promote what? You know, what scares me is whether or not this PR firm was involved. I don't know in their education, CDC's education. I think I mentioned I went online and took one of their courses, you know, in order to get some credits, and I got about halfway through, and Deborah Horry was just lying through her teeth, you know, or making up stuff, you know, and it really made opiates sound like they should never be used. You know, because if you read the CDC guidelines, it doesn't tell you in there when to use them. I mean, that's kind of an unusual medical paper on a drug. Normally, we doctors will read a paper on antidepressants, for example. So it starts off by saying, here are the indications. This is when you use it. And these are the contraindications. This is when you can't use it. And these are the side effects and blah, blah, blah. But the CDC is called the Guidelines for Prescribing Opiates in Chronic Pain. And it should say, these are guidelines for not prescribing, because nowhere in my reading does it say when you use these. It doesn't discuss what chronic diseases need to be treated. They don't seem to know that there are diseases like complex regional pain syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, interstitial cystitis, adhesive arachnoiditis, trigeminal neuralgia, cranial pain syndromes, central pain syndromes, inflammation of the brain. These are real diseases, and they're not discussed in the CDC guidelines, which I'm afraid as a doctor, I have to ask questions. Why, when you have something called guidelines for the prescribing, there's no guidelines for the prescribing? There's only guidelines for reducing prescribing or being careful, that we should be careful. We're careful every time we prescribe anything. What a slap in the face. Sadly, 2/3 of family practitioners and internists in this country in the last 3 years have quit prescribing pain medicine. That's our primary job as doctors. That's horrible. And why have they done that? Because they are scared to death that the government has set new guidelines, which they cannot do at the CDC, only at the FDA, and they're going to send out the police after you if you don't follow the CDC guidelines. And do you know what? That's true. The Assistant Attorney General Rothstein said that, quote, "We are accepting the CDC guidelines." Now, apparently he doesn't know anything about medicine either, and he should, because only the FDA is in charge, and the FDA has no limits. So the caller or the question that came in, be very careful about anything that you read coming out of the CDC, because as far as I'm concerned, it's so biased and it is so corrupted and it is so deceitful that anybody who follows these unmandated guidelines is sticking their neck out. Any doctor that would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, my patient committed suicide because I cut her off her medicines," and doctor, what's your defense for this? "Oh, the CDC guidelines." Doctor, do you realize that they aren't mandated? "Oh, they aren't." Do you realize, doctor, that the FDA mandates all these rules and they say you can treat to whatever you want? So why did you reduce her? End of trial. Doctors really have their necks out and they don't realize it.
Well, the crazy part too is that Prop tried to get the FDA to do these guidelines and push that agenda, and they said no. But then they went to the CDC and they accepted it.
Yeah, they took. I'm actually preparing a new paper to put on Medium about exactly just taking quotes from the FDA thing. Basically, the FDA said they were not going to approve any kind of limits on opiates, period, and that the evidence presented was not strong enough for them to do that, and they didn't do it. So, in other words, the federal agency in charge of prescription drugs already said these are bogus, and then they just ran over to the CDC down in Atlanta and did it anyway. So.
Okay. All right. Last question. Who do you call first if advocating to legislators? And how do you get the contact information?
Well, I lived in Boston for 20 years, and Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He wrote a book called "All Politics is Local." So you start locally. So what you want to do is start with your state representative. I like representatives because they represent a smaller group. And so how do you find out who your state representative is? A lot of people don't know. Actually, I didn't know until I looked it up. So what you do is you get out your Google and you say, who is my state representative? It'll take you to a little website. You plug in your address, and it'll tell you who it is and the phone number. Okay? Now, the next thing is that you need to plan a little phone call or an email. Phone calls are always better. Politics is local. You need to talk to people. And you need to say, I'm very concerned that I have lost access to my medical care. And that's all you got to say. Because then they're going to become curious and they're going to say, well, tell me more. And then you tell your story. And you tell it briefly. And you tell it in a monotone. I went to 10 doctors. They refused to treat and now's when you bring in your disease. Don't say my chronic pain. You say, refuse to treat my rheumatoid arthritis, my adhesive arachnoiditis. Oh, what's that? Well, this is a disease that, see, you right away, you're talking about disease now. You're not talking about laying awake at night in pain, and nobody knows why. And also, I just tweeted today, when you talk about your disease, just pick one. A lot of times people rattle off all these diseases. Just pick one. Because if you start rattling off a bunch of diseases, people think you're over-explaining. So if you just say, I have complex regional pain syndrome, period, and I have not been able to find anybody to treat it. Oh, treat it with what? Well, it's an incurable disease, so the only thing that can be done is, to take antihistamines and to use pain medicine to control the inflammation. And I can't find anybody to do that. And here's what's happened to me since. I sit on the couch trying to think about my pain and make it go away. And I lay in a bathtub on a blow-up mattress so I can feel the warmth coming through to try to make my pain go away. And I'm not making love anymore. I'm not raising my kids. I can't. I just sit. So that's the kind of story you need to tell, because people who have been cut off by hypocrites, people that run around saying, oh, I love my neighbor. Oh, we need to help out people. No, that's not what's happened. What's happened is people are being harmed. And if you just tell your little simple story like that, and then they're going to say, what do you want me to do? And then you can say, well, I don't know, but I do need to know that I can help me to find a doctor. You see, then the legislators are going to start trying to think of solutions, because we'll go to a doctor and the doctor helps you with medical solutions. You go to a lawyer and they help you with legal solutions. You go to a legislator, they're going to help you with drafting new laws to solve the problem. First, they have to believe there's a problem. So it's important to kind of rehearse ahead of time. You can practice in front of the mirror. It's very hard when you're telling your own story. Don't go on and on and on. You've got to condense it to your main problem. And your main problem is there's been an interference with your doctor-patient relationship. What do you mean by that? Well, apparently, from what I've heard, doctors are so frightened of the DEA and the CDC, they're just not going to prescribe opiates anymore. These drugs have been prescribed for 5,000 years, and they've worked fine. Then if they start asking technical questions, you say, I really don't know, but I can find out, and I'll get back to you. And you can ask me, you can ask Red Lawhern, you can ask a lot of people who are advocates, for some help. And legislators don't think you have all the answers. So you just take a little notebook and you say, oh, okay, let me find out and get you some information. And then we can supply you the specific information. Much better to get a legislator asking you questions. Take a little notebook with you. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. I'll find out. And that's very healthy when they start to ask questions. If they just sit there rocking in their chair and going, boy, this must be awful. And you can say, yeah, it is awful. And then you can tell a few more stories about how you don't go to church anymore, you don't go to shul anymore, because you're just too sick. What do you mean sick? And then tell people what it means to be sick. What is it like? Well, I sit in my chair and I have these pains, and then I have muscle spasms, And I just feel like, well, have you ever had the flu? You remember how you felt when you had the flu on the first day? That's how I feel every single day. Ever try to get out of bed when you have the flu and go to work, or go down to the store, or be a grandfather or a father? No, nobody functions on the first day of the flu. You lay in bed, whining. And most pain patients don't even whine. But I talked to somebody on the phone today. She's been cut off by her doctors. No reason whatsoever, just cut off after years and years of successful treatment with this ancient God's own drug, as the famous Johns Hopkins doctor said in 1900, I believe he said that. And so you just tell your story, but tell it in pieces. Pause. Wait for questions. See, that's how you get your point across. You don't get your point across by delivering a 30-minute sermon. You get your point across by talking for 5 minutes. This is why you need to rehearse. You can take notes with you. Look at your notes. And you can take other people with you if you go into the office. It is best to go to the office, and they're very friendly. You can say, look, I have a problem with getting access to doctors, and I would like to come in and talk about it. Now, your local representative is a politician. Politicians have these skills, and their skills are, how are we going to solve this problem using legislation? That person may say to you, hey, why don't you talk to your federal representative? Or why don't you talk to your state senator? But always start with your state representative and work up from there. Plus, you'll learn how to call the office. You'll feel a little more comfortable. And then, you might want to talk to your United States representative in Congress, your congressman or congresswoman. And by now, you'll kind of know a little bit more about how to pitch your problem. It's real simple. If you're a hog farmer and you're having problems with too many regulations interfering with the purchase of hog feed, that's a real problem. And so the legislator may think, well, let me see what we can come up with. The reason you go to a legislator is because you don't have an answer. If we had answers, we wouldn't have to go to the people who can help us with laws and regulations. So it's like a consultant. If you've got a broken bone, you go see an orthopedic surgeon. If you've got a tooth that's hurting, you go see the consultant who's a dentist. If you've got a problem with your will, you go to your lawyer. If you've got a problem that you can't solve, you go to your legislator. And they hear this every day, and some things they can fix and some they don't. Depends on what kind of case you're making. It's always good if you can go with 2 or 3 other people, or you can go and take a little video, a little 5-minute video of another friend, who tells their story in 5 minutes. So legislators right now are very important. This wildfire is totally out of control, and it was accelerated by the CDC. It is their fault. I'm sorry. If you throw a cigarette butt out the window and it starts a forest fire, you can say, oh, I just did it by accident. Nope. You are culpable. And it's your job to take care of the problem. It's your job to talk to the families who killed themselves because they didn't have any medicine for their pain. And talk to the families of all the people who lost jobs, whose lives are ruined, who sit all day on the couch. CDC needs to talk to these people, and they haven't done it.
Well, you're right. But it's not even just patients, it's doctors now. And I mean, we're seeing doctors, offices being raided and going to jail for life, just like Dr. Stephen Henson. I know we were going to talk about that a little bit tonight. Did you guys want to?
Yeah, because that was sort of the main topic for tonight, so we'll launch into that. One of the things that concerns me is we need to go public with this. We need, as doctors, help from people. We need help from people who are clever, who can come up with ideas, who maybe know some lawyers, because we're in it. We're in the soup. So we're not the best ones to really tell the story. We can, like with the legislators, we can sort of present the problem. One of the problems, Linda, is I'm finding that the lawyers are telling their clients, the doctors, don't talk about this. I had a fellow he was in another state. He was a nice guy. He was independent, which I'm finding seems to be a syndrome. He's independent. He was doing the right thing, and he got raided. And I said, send me a copy of the indictment. It's public. Indictments are public. And all of a sudden, he just closed down and closed his email. So I know what happened. He went and talked to his lawyers. Oh, my God, don't talk to anybody about this. Well, lawyers used to tell us, if you make a mistake with a patient, don't tell them. Yeah, well, that's what caused all the lawsuits. People are going, how come the guy didn't even come and discuss it with me, that he made a mistake? So now we go and we talk to our patients when we make a mistake. And that improves the outcome. It doesn't guarantee you're not going to get sued, but it improves the outcome. It's the same thing. I think it's time we go public with all these cases. And Linda runs an organization called Doctors of Courage, which you can find on the internet, and you can go there and you can read about some of these cases and kind of see it from our standpoint as doctors. And we need your help. Doctors and patients need to stick together on this because we're both being screwed. Patients are suffering. We're going to jail. We're losing our practices. And here's an interesting question that I don't have an answer to, but for Linda, in 1215, King John was backed down by his subjects because they were saying, just because you're a duke or something doesn't mean you can't go to trial. And he said, okay, I agree. He said, but there's a stipulation. If you take a duke to trial, you have to have a jury of his peers or her peers, mainly dukes or he's. And so that's when the idea of trial by your peers started. If you're in the military and you're a bird colonel, you're a full colonel, and you're accused of something, you don't have lieutenants and captains on the jury. You only have full colonels and above. Now, it's interesting that when physicians are taken to federal court, they are accused of practicing medicine outside legal practice limits. That's a medical issue. So basically, the doctor is on trial for his or her practice of medicine. And if I were a lawyer, I would ask for a jury of peers. If it's going to be about medicine, then it should be a jury of nurses and doctors. And part of the problem with doctors being convicted is a violation of that. If you had somebody who's an engineer and builds bridges, and the federal government said the engineer was negligent because they didn't apply this principle and that principle of engineering and was outside of the practice of engineering, that should be a trial by peers. Now, we just try anybody we want in court, but there's still that principle of trial by peers. So what happens in the jury room is the lawyers, in my estimation, frequently don't understand doctoring, and they don't know how to explain it to the jury. This is why it would be nice to have physicians as defense attorneys. At least they would understand that people are afraid of these opiates so badly that they feel any doctor who prescribes opiates to people is part of the problem. So you just got caught. There are people who really believe, including the Mayo Clinic. If you go on the Mayo Clinic website on opiates, it says anyone can become addicted. So I think part of these problems reside in the trial courts. Linda, do you think that is part of the problem, or what are your thoughts?
Well, basically, any doctor now that becomes charged will probably be convicted and in court, because the courts have a 98% conviction rate, federal courts. Now, I'm only speaking about federal courts. I've not had any experience with state courts. The reason why they have a 98% conviction rate is because they do use illegal tactics to convict us. And this has been ongoing, at least as far back as I know, since the Richard Anderson Enron fiasco back in the early 2000s, where they simply constructed a crime by taking a phrase here and a phrase there and putting them together and then saying this is a law when it wasn't. And they got Enron basically broke down. Richard Anderson's firm was totally destroyed. And what happened was the people who did that got promoted. The lawyers that were in the government ended up becoming like Wilder was one. And so what they found out was that, oh, well, we can create and then the legislature does nothing to stop this. So now we have rogue agencies creating laws where there are no laws and putting innocent people in prison. And that is happening to doctors, but it's happening throughout the country. The problem is that there have been multiple Supreme Court decisions saying that this is not right, but the government doesn't enforce. The Supreme Court is not an enforcer. So just because something comes out of the Supreme Court doesn't mean that it's going to be followed, as is shown in our cases of all of the doctors that are still currently being incarcerated, even though case law says that they can't. So it's basically just we are under the jurisdiction of a rogue government, a rogue DOJ, and see if I can find it here. There is a particular, I'm looking at, by the way, in case y'all are looking, oh, you have my picture up, okay. So you're not having to look at me. That's a good thing. I'm going to look at my computer here and get my slide to say that the case law that I can quote here says, hold on one second, I find it, that Walder versus U.S. This is pertaining to the Fourth Amendment, which is how the government basically breaks into any doctor's office is by violating our Fourth Amendment. Walder versus U.S. says the government cannot violate the Fourth Amendment through its agents and use the fruits of such conduct to secure a conviction. All right, so but they're doing it all the time to doctors. It says these methods are outlawed and convictions obtained by these means are invalidated because they encourage the kind of society that is obnoxious to free men. Prosecutors should not be allowed to fabricate and lie on a request for a search warrant. This is a violation of the person's Fourth Amendment rights. By flagrant abuse of this authority, the government can invade the private domain of anyone in this country that they choose. This has to be stopped. This breeds anarchy. And folks, anarchy is what we're headed for as soon as the American population realizes. That's what it's going to take, though. It's going to take this word to get out to them, for them to realize that we have a rogue Department of Justice, that no one who enters the federal judicial system is probably a criminal. That's the problem. They are able to convict us based on lies, based on perjury. For my own personal testimony, and for anyone who's listening that does not know me personally, I am a convicted felon based on treating pain. And even though I was taking patients off of opiates because I was curing their problem, I'm a natural physician, and I actually treated patients naturally and got rid of the condition so they didn't need the opiates anymore. I was doing that, which of course also is against government interests, because the government's number one economy is sickness care. Everybody needs to stay sick. That's why we use pharmaceuticals, because we stay sick. But I was my nurse in my office was taken into a interrogation room. She was interrogated for 6 hours. She was told, this is what we want you to say. If you do not say it, you will go to prison. And they kept hammering her. She refused to perjure herself. She refused to lie against me on the witness stand. So this is the kind of, you can't believe any witness the government puts on the court, on the in the witness chair. But the problem is the American people don't understand that and don't know that. That's what we have to get out to people, is that
Well,
we are
that's
dealing.
that's kind of why I thought that people should share in the problems legally that we're having. And Linda brought up the Fourth Amendment. You know, our Constitution really is an absolutely beautiful document. It's unbelievable. The Fourth Amendment says that you cannot have your privacy invaded unless there is probable cause. Two very important reasons. You go to a judge and you say, well, gee, as I just read here, I have an indictment from one of the doctors, and sometime we're going to discuss them by name when they give me permission, said that, the doctor prescribed to 45 patients residing in 25 states. That's perfectly legal. Doctors prescribe to people in other states all the time. You know, you go to the Mass General and they write you a prescription and you go back to Arizona, you can get it filled. That's not illegal. But the violation of the Fourth Amendment by the drug police is especially bad. And they just had that recently reversed. Last year in April, a new law was passed, and it said, guess what? FDA has to use probable cause. Wait a minute. I thought that was in the Constitution. No. The FDA had the authority under the Nixon law to arrest people to protect the public safety. They had a different standard. And now they have the standard of probable cause. So Linda is right. Whenever what goes wrong in countries is usually the federal police. Okay? When the federal police get out of hand, and are they out of hand? I don't know. I'm not a analyst. Yes. I just have questions. And Linda says yes. So how do we fix that? Well, James Madison, my man, who he and Adams got together and did the checks and balances. You go to your legislators. All politics is local. The legislators can pass laws to protect whoever is being abused, whether it's immigrants or doctors or black folks or whoever. But first we have to make it public. So I'm just going to give you a couple things that were listed in a search warrant for a very famous pain doctor. Oxycodone is generally used for a modest number of dosage units. That's their word for pills. Oxycodone is generally issued for a modest number of dosage units. That's not true. The FDA says you can prescribe as many as you need. Oxycodone is extremely addictive. That's not true. All opiates are addictive, pretty much to the same degree. Hydrocodone, which is one of our weakest pills, is extremely addictive, this federal search warrant says. That's not true. Fentanyl is the most powerful narcotic available on the prescription market, it says in the federal search warrant. That's not true. The most powerful drug is Suboxone. Writing for an extremely high number of pills at one time. This is normal. High is not defined. See, all this stuff is medical. You see, the feds, and it's not just the DEA. The DEA gets blamed for a lot of stuff. These are the attorney generals that are writing this stuff, not the police. The police are carrying out the wishes of the attorney generals. So if we want to pass laws, it is about the attorney generals. If patients are actually using all the medicines prescribed, they are at a very high risk for addiction, overdose, and death. Although you hear about this a lot, it is not true. So they are making these medical judgments that are not true. The impression of prescribing high opioids is likely to be harmful to patients. That's not true. All of these things were in a federal search warrant. The doctor prescribed large volumes of benzodiazepines. What's that? Large volume compared to what? I mean, I can say there are way too many elephants running around in the United States. And there's actually 10 of them in Tennessee running around. on a great big reserve. But you see how easily it is to make the large volumes of benzodiazepines. See how they're painting the picture? This is all medical stuff. These are medical charges. This should be done in the state courts, rather in the state medical licensing agencies. As a matter of fact, there was a Supreme Court decision called Linder back in 1925, and that's what they said. The federal government has no right in the practice of medicine. Anything that tests positive for interfering with the practice of medicine should be at the state level in the Board of Registration of Medicines, the Licensing Bureau. This is not the purview of the federal government to interfere with the doctor-patient relationship. That is a professional issue, and professional issues are handled in state licensing boards and state courts, not in the federal court. So we've got a great big boo-boo here. The federal government is trying to interfere with the doctor-patient relationship, just as I've been reading from this. I have other indictments, same sort of thing. Oh, here's one. In the indictment, the federal indictment, the doctor performed cursory physical examinations. Whoa. So what? The federal police know how much of an examination somebody needs? I see people all the time that are stable and I just do a quick exam, check their blood pressure and stuff, listen to their heart. It takes me 3 or 4 minutes. I suppose, according to the federal prosecuting attorneys, that would be considered a cursory examination. But determining what a cursory examination is not the purview of the federal government. It is the purview of state licensing boards. If somebody thinks I'm doing cursory exams, then I go and appear before my licensing board, not in a federal court.
Dr. Kline, we have a caller. Do you mind? Would you like to take one? Okay.
Sure.
Caller from area code 256. What is your name and what's your question for Dr. Kline? Dr. Cheek.
Extremely difficult.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. What's your question? Go ahead.
My question is that I guess I live in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama. And, I have gotten pretty sick since 2016. My doctor fled, Dr. Mark Murphy. He left Alabama and went to Tennessee. And I've gotten a lot of answers listening to you guys, but
go ahead.
I don't really have a question. My question is more of a statement. I'm afraid to go to the doctor. I'm sick, and I know I'm sick, and I'm getting sicker, but I am in so much pain that I don't want to get better.
All right. What you need to do.
Since 2016. And it's just gotten worse because Mark Murphy was controlling it. He's gone. He was a brilliant, and he's still working, by the way.
Can you go see him in Tennessee?
Well, I guess I could walk in, but he's only seeing people 3 times a week because
why don't you, if you're an old
him
patient, all right. If you're an old patient of his, he should respect the fact, and you got along okay. You can say, look, I've been looking for a replacement, and I can't find it. Would it be okay if I came and saw you there? And you can do that. You can go see a doctor in another state. That's perfectly legal. The feds try to pretend like it isn't, but it is, and he can write you prescriptions, and they can be filled in your state with a pharmacist who understands the problem, or you can fill the prescriptions in Tennessee. You have to maybe go back every month, but that's a potential out for you because, if you have a trusting doctor who's moved and still practicing, call them up and say, I've tried my best.
I got a question for you. Actually, I've got 2. And I know that you don't want fentanyl to be taken away, and I understand there are people that probably or feel that they need it, but that they put fentanyl into the statistics of why we have a problem now. They include that as a pharmaceutical, which it is, but most of it is illegal.
Of course, so and people who are using it, and people who are dying
so
from
that then
it
they go
addicts. Yeah, go ahead.
Their numbers. So I guess I wanted you to play around with that for a minute, and all of you guys think about it, because y'all are the doctors, And I know y'all have been through a lot because Dr. Murphy told me, and even the doctors I go to now, they tell me what they have to go through for me. And I was born with a birth defect, and it's very hard to explain to doctors when they start saying, but what do you have? But what do you have? But what do you have? I have a congenital birth defect in both knees, and my kneecaps, they popped out a joint when I was younger, and it worked its way, into a really bad problem when I got older. But I worked as a teacher. I went to college. I became educated enough to see through what was going on in our government when I started reading the charts, and the charts don't make any sense that the CDC puts out. The second thing I was going to say, if it hasn't left my mind because I'm very sick, I'm sorry, is that the press, they never mention us.
No, they don't.
There's no
Never.
money in it. There's no money in taking care of pain patients. In fact, here in the Southwest part of Virginia, where there is a huge amount of drug abuse, and I think that actually there are probably just as many pain patients that are now dying as there are addicts dying because of the pain patients being forced to the street to get their medicines, and they're self-medicating. And of course, that's another whole long time to talk to explain how that happens. But the law enforcement is actually using the term now with all the deaths and everything as what is it? They're limiting the herd. They're making the herd smaller. In other words, they're getting rid of the people that they want to get rid of.
Well, all politics is local.
That's like creating a master race.
Yeah, it is. But it's
see,
good
doctors and what y'all were saying in this last thing, I'm going to say doctors and patients need to work together because you guys have it hard. I've watched a recent doctor I had to say bye to, my psychiatrist, and he went to the hospital so he could get out of practice and go to a hospital and really work with really serious patients. But
it's pretty bad, and telling stories about your doctor is really helpful. When we go in, they go, yeah, right, But remember, all politics is local. What we were talking about before, find out who your state legislator is in Alabama, and go talk to them. You told a great story just now. This is the same kind of story they need to hear. It impressed me, so it would impress a legislator. You've got a nice way about you. You're not hysterical. You're just telling the story as it is. And, pick a name, by the way, for your knee problem. Just pick a name. There should be one. You've got an unstable patella or something. Or you've got congenital knee problems. That's fine. Stick to your one diagnosis and go talk to them about what your life is like having been taken off pain medicines by doctors who did not fully explain to you why they were doing it, and they didn't ask your consent. And this somebody is interfering with a doctor-patient relationship because these doctors are leaving town, are not prescribing, or joining hospitals to get out of the practice. So you start to plant seeds like that, and the legislators' ears are going to perk up. Also, it's important to tell legislators that 3% of the population in the United States and in all states takes opiates, and 2/3 of those have been taken off. That's 3% of the voters. That's a huge number for a politician.
All right, we have one other caller, a caller from area code 703. What is your name and what's your question for the doctors?
Doctors, this is G.
Hi, G.
Hello, AKA Virginia Woolf, online. And I'm going to be speaking in front of 2 congressional subcommittees next Wednesday, as well as 2 senatorial subcommittees on the same day later on after we have lunch. Sorry, I've just been all over the place. I'm going on behalf of two organizations, one which I'm a founder of, and this is all came upon me very quickly. In any case, I have the legislator's ear. Okay, we have a lot of money behind me now. Okay, Doc, and doctors, if you will. Okay, what do you recommend I say to the subcommittees?
Start with the main problem. There's been an interference with the doctor-patient relationship by the federal government.
Got it.
That's the number one thing. And then number two, they're going to ask you, well, how is that happening? Then you can start enumerating all the problems. There's four main areas. DEA is prosecuting doctors.
Yeah, I've got that too.
Okay. Number two, the pharmacists and benefit managers are limiting the supplies of the medicines needed to treat painful disease. Always use the word painful disease, not chronic pain, painful disease. Number three.
So that one. Okay.
Number three are the doctors. 2/3 of the doctors in the last 3 years of family practitioners have quit prescribing. And so why have they quit prescribing? Because they're afraid of the DEA and using the CDC phony guidelines that are not mandated by FDA. That's what they're afraid of.
Dr. Kline, I have you already. Yeah, I have the DEA.
You're way ahead of me. All right, so
No, I'm behind you, and I've got it. Go ahead.
Okay, so we got the federal police, we got the doctors, we got the pharmacists, and what's the fourth group? You know, the problem is I haven't had my donuts yet.
Well, I was going to go. Well, you have more than I've had because this came on me so quickly. I learned on Monday that I'm going to be speaking. So I literally just got my hotel, secondary hotel that's closer to the one the president of the national organization has been calling about. Excuse me. In any case, Doc, I've got your back. Don't worry about that. What I was going to go at was CPP and IPP patients. We're supposed to be able to get our medications. However, how do I also protect the doctors? That's me putting it very simply. It's put a little better in a bullet line. But I have some people looking over that now. I hope that is what's here.
We can talk later too. You know, you can email me, but the DEA needs to let doctors know by email that the CDC guidelines they claim to be following are not proper and that they need to be following FDA guidelines. Number two, the DEA needs to let all doctors know what they will not be prosecuted for.
That was what I was going for with the DEA and DOJ, that you will not be prosecuted by helping CPP, IPP patients. Or I know it's patients or CPP, IPPs. And my point would be, how am I supposed to get my medication when I can't even have my doctor, he's too scared to go beyond 90 milligrams, if you will. So,
right, which is an illegal.
That's my big problem.
Yeah, the CDC is an illegal document because they formed it to look like a regulation. It looks like,
of course,
it smells like a regulation, but it is not. And not only that,
it's a recommendation.
It's a recommendation. And so doctors have the choice of following the legal mandates at FDA, which has no limit, versus some recommendations from the communicable disease people. They can choose. If they choose a non-federally recognized agency, they got to be careful because if anything goes wrong, they're not going to have a defense. You know.
Okay.
So,
now here's. Doc, there's
lastly,
one thing.
The 90 milligrams is only for first-time patients, even in the CDC regulation. Okay.
Exactly. Now, what I thought I'd bring up, which also my group, I wanted to say really quickly, the group wants me to bring up bullet NIH because I've been to NIH 5 times. Okay, they want to bring that up for the group, insofar as the groups being the DMRF and the NSTA, which I'm a founder of, which that's what got me in it. I can go in next year as well. And I didn't know I could have gone last year, but in any case, back to topic. Also, I'm working on 3.5 hours sleep, no food, and please bear with. I'm so sorry about this.
And Dr. Chief wanted to
make. But I have to bring up NIH as being a governmental org. So that's what
I
my
think
point
Dr.
would be to
Cheek
bring
had
them.
a little comment.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry,
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Cheek. Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's okay. If you would email me, my email is lindacheekmd@gmail. I can send you the list of concerns and demands that we presented to Congress back last May. They're still pertinent. They're still necessary, and there's too many of them for me to read them off to you, but I'll be happy to send them to you.
Okay.
And if you
I
go
would
to
love
Thomas,
it because I'm.
Thomas Kline, MD.
Go ahead.
The main
Okay,
thing
let me get yours. Yeah.
Linda, you go.
I'm listening.
The main thing we need to do is get the legislators to have a congressional hearing on the illegal activity of the DOJ against illegal use of the Controlled Substance Act against doctors.
Yep.
You're not going to get treated for pain.
I agree.
As long as innocent doctors are going to prison.
For long periods of time. And did you know that each prescription written that the government disagrees with is a felony in itself?
Yes.
I believe it. I did not know that.
Yeah, when you go to trial, the indictment reads, and the other thing, this is another interest, and this goes into the whole idea that the Controlled Substance Act was not designed for doctors. It was designed for offshore, bringing in illegal drugs from offshore, because the other thing that they have to do in order to sentence the doctor is they have to convert every prescription and every pill, every milligram of a substance prescribed by that doctor to the equivalent marijuana in order to give the doctor a sentence. Now, does that tell you something or what?
Right.
Okay.
Matter of fact,
that does tell me something.
All people convicted of drug crimes are convicted and sentenced by how many milligrams they had on them, even if you're a drug lord.
But they're converted to marijuana.
Yeah.
Okay, a doctor's
it is converted to marijuana.
Is converted to the equivalent grams of marijuana. In other words, they have Lortab is equal to a 5 milligram Lortab is equal to 5 milligrams of marijuana. 5 milligram oxycodone is equivalent to 7.5 milligrams of marijuana. They add up then how many grams of marijuana the doctor has been dealing in to sentence them.
That's why doctors get these enormous sentences, 20, 30 years. And you cannot, by the way, you cannot compare narcotic with marijuana yet. And also the Controlled Substance Act by Richard Nixon in 1970 created the DEA just to enforce that particular law. In 1994, John Ehrlichman confessed that Richard Nixon only wrote that law to capture and prosecute his enemies.
Basically, blacks and anti-war folks.
And this is why there's such high sentences. He wanted them creamed. See, he would go to a Black Panthers meeting, find one person with cocaine, and all of a sudden there's a 30-year sentence, and everybody else in the room was a co-conspirator.
And the original, problem with the drugs being attacked in the first place was basically Jim Crow. When the Civil War freed all black folks, and they eventually were able to vote, well, the white supremacist government said, "Oh, well, we don't want blacks to be able to vote, so let's create crimes against them, and then we can put them in prison." And then, by the way, prison is basically slave labor. Okay? So
it is. Yeah.
You work for 5 cents an hour in prison. Okay, doing whatever job they have you do. Okay? So it's basically slave labor, and then they basically targeted these laws to enforce against blacks and the Orientals,
right?
Because the Orientals back in the early 1900s had what are called opium dens, and an opium den wasn't anything bad. It was simply a place where they smoked their opium, just like you would go into a bar now and have a drink. The Orientals went into these opium dens, so they said, okay, we can get rid of the Orientals, we can get rid of the blacks, and we're back to a white supremacist politics. Okay, that's the whole purpose of going after drugs. Period is a racist thing. and people just can't. They're the now. Okay, what is the opioid crisis? There is no opioid crisis. In 1980, the government, when they did the studies to form a law pertaining to add to the Controlled Substance Act, they said that there were 300,000 to 500,000 heroin users in the United States. Well, do you know how? Well, I'm sorry, they said 500,000. That was in 1980. Do you know how many they claim to have as heroin addicts in the United States now? 300,000 to 500,000. It is actually less now than it was in 1980 when they expanded on the Controlled Substance Act. But the difference is that the primary person now that's getting addicted, that's going to the street for drugs, guess what? It's not a black man.
Are the people who are being cut off? It's the white.
It's a white female between 20 and 25. Now, why would that be?
Interesting.
This is something okay. Nobody has even considered except for me because of my alternative medicine. Why are white females now going to drugs for their answers to their problems? The big crisis we have in this country is sex abuse. Did you know that 30 years ago, a study was done, and they determined that 42% of the females in the United States are sexually abused. Now, that was 30 years ago, or even maybe more than that now, and we haven't even done a study on that. So, that is a major stressor. And childhood abuse, what is called ACEs, what's the A stand for? But childhood traumas are the number one cause of people to become drug addicts. Because
I've heard this statistic too. We're kind of running out of time, and the caller, you have Dr. Cheek's email. You can go to her website, Doctors of Courage. You can go to my website, which is Thomas Kline, Kline, MD, all one word, .com, and my email is Thomas Kline, MD, same thing, at gmail.com. And we can see if we can assist you. Feel free to ask us questions. And, we're both doctors and we like giving opinions, even when it's not asked for.
All righty. So let's wrap up here. Thank you so much for calling in, caller. Dr. Cheek, what would you like to end us with this evening?
We have to show the American people, publicize the American people of what the government is doing that is illegal, that is putting doctors illegally into prison. And we have to teach people what really causes addiction, and it's not the drugs.
And also, I think we need to realize when doctors are stripped of their ability to practice or put in prison, what happens to their patients?
They go to the street.
They go to the street because once you're a patient of a doctor who's been under a cloud, nobody will take you as a patient.
Or even if they would, the waiting time is 6 months. And the problem is they go out, they maybe are off their medicine for a few days or maybe a few weeks. They go out on the street and they try to find a drug. Of course, they don't know equivalencies. They just get what's available. And so they might be only on 3 Percocets a day. And they go out on the street and they buy 40 milligram Oxycontins, and that's an overdose. Or the big thing is methadone. Because methadone on the street, people, it is not an acute pain medicine. You've got to be on methadone for a week for it to actually reach therapeutic levels. But it builds up in the system, and so a person will take one and think that's going to treat their pain, and it doesn't. They take another within the same day. It doesn't treat their pain. But by the 3rd day, they're dead because the methadone builds up, because they've taken it so much thinking it will treat their pain, but their pain treatment isn't going to happen for a week down the road. So methadone on the street is a big killer. Also, the methadone mixed with the Xanax is a big killer.
And you see, all of this is going on because the federal government interfered with the doctor-patient relationship. In Canada, if you're an addict, you go to the doctor. If you have pain, you go to the same doctor. In this country, it is illegal for me, and I could lose my license, if I were to accidentally treat somebody with addiction disease. That's the federal government interfering with the doctor-patient relationship. Addicts are God's children too, and they deserve to have medical care, and they are denied medical care by the United States government. So we need to say good night, and thank you, caller, and thank you, Dr. Linda Cheek,
You're
for
welcome.
joining
Thank
us.
Thank you for having me. I hope I've been of some help.
You have a very interesting perspective on things that I've not heard before, so that's good.
Okay.
And
All right,
Janelle?
Yep. All righty. Well, I want to say a big thank you to our audience for taking some time out of your evening to join us here at the Doctor's Corner. Please don't forget, if you have any mailbag questions that you'd like to write in, please email them to janelle.elgaway@caw360.com. I'm Janelle Elgaway with Dr. Kline signing off until next Tuesday. Have a great evening, Caw Nation.
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.